Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this new Greytalk, the first after the summer break. We are delighted to have with us Dr. Professor Franz Baumann. And the title of his Greytalk today is That Plan from Rio, the Promise and Limits of Multilateral Climate Governance. I recognize our honorary president, Michael Muller, who is joining us, and I thank you all very much for joining. And as was mentioned in the publicity of this Greytalk, Dr. Baumann will guide us through the past, present, and future of global efforts to combat climate change, discover the profound impact of Rio's plan, and the challenges that lie ahead in the critical mission to safeguard our planet. And I'm extremely happy of the title that you put to this Greytalk, Dr. Baumann, because as you know, there are many Monday quarterbacks or morning coaches that they know exactly what should have been done then. And they always tell you, if we had information that we have now, then we would have done things differently. So through your going through the past, current situation, and your insights on the future, I think we'll have a clearer picture of what we are doing and what we should be doing different. Just for the record, I would like to mention some information about the bio of Dr. Professor Franz Baumann. He began his career with the United Nations, serving as an associate expert in Nigeria for the United Nations Development Program and the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO. He then worked in various departments at the United Nations Secretariat, including those of Management and Peacekeeping, and in the Office of the Secretary General. He was Chief Administrative Officer of the Joint United Nations Organization and American States Drought Monitoring Mission in Haiti. He was Director of Management of the United Office in Vienna, Deputy Director of the United Nations Office in Vienna, Deputy Executive Director of the United Nations Office in Drugs and Crime, Acting Director of the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. In 2009, as the Assistant Director General for General Assembly and Conference Management at the United Nations Secretariat. In 2014, he became Senior Deployment Coordinator for UMOJA, that is an administrative reform initiative for the United Nations Secretariat that includes a thorough streamlining of UN business processes. His last assignment was as Special Advisor on Environment and Peace Operations with the rank of Assistant Secretary General. He left the United Nations at the end of 2015 and joined the New York University in 2017 as a visiting research professor. He's a senior fellow and a member of the Board of Trustees of the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. In September 2015, he became Special Advisor on Environment and Peace. Please, I would like to give the floor now to Manela, who will explain us how the Greytalk will develop. Please, Manela, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Alejandro. Just very briefly, the rules of the game are always the same and very simple. Write your comments or your questions in a very short manner in the chat discussion in the column on the right of your screen. And then at the end of the presentation, we will certainly try to manage as best as we can a discussion with our presenter. But please, not to waste time, Dr. Baumann, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Manuela. Thank you, Alejandro, for the lovely introduction. One point I should like to make is that 30 years ago, Michael Muller was my boss. I was a P4 and he ran, you mentioned, the first and I think only joint UN regional organization mission, which was a human rights monitoring mission in Haiti. And Michael ran the UN side of it together with a lovely man, Colin Granderson, for the OAS. So it was a very interesting experience for me to work with Michael and to see how he built up a mission and the spirit he infused the mission with. So thank you, Michael, and I'm very pleased to see you. It was 30 years ago, 1993.
Nice to see you, Franz.
Yeah. No, and the UN, and you mentioned it, Alejandro, it was a very good employer for me. So I joined indeed 35 years ago as a P2 in Africa. African studies was my field. And I served in 3 cities on 4 continents under 5 secretaries general, starting with Kurt Waldheim, and then Peres de Cuellar, and then Boutros Ghali, Kofi Annan, and Ban Ki-moon. And I left at the end of 2015. Now, actually, I was not going to talk about my paper because I thought you will all read it. And even today only I got from the publisher the copy edited version. So it will come out soon. And I'm very pleased with it. It comes out in a journal in New York called Social Research, which is in its 75th year. It was the journal of the University in Exile, mainly run by German, Jewish, or socialist or communist academics who in the 1930s had to flee and who were given a home at the New School for Social Research in New York. And so they were people like Hannah Arendt, Erich Fromm, Herbert Marcuse, Hans Jonas. Very many famous German exile academics started the journal and wrote in it. And it's in the 75th year, and they commissioned this article, and as I said, it will come out. But what I wanted to talk to you about is the paradoxon that the climate crisis is accelerating. Ever more catastrophic consequences are becoming obvious, as we have seen in the year 2023 with the Mediterranean burning, with Canada, where we spent the summer burning. New York, I was there on the 7th of June. You could not go out. You couldn't see the sun. It was a sunny day. So the catastrophe is accelerating exactly as science has predicted for the last 30, maybe one could even say for the last 200 years. To French scientists Fourier and Pouillet in the early 19th century calculated that burning of fossil fuels will warm the atmosphere. It was very much confirmed by a woman. When I started teaching this in 2017, she didn't have a website. Her name is Eunice Foote, and she was from Long Island in the mid-19th century. And her papers had to be presented by men, by male colleagues, because people would not have listened to her as a woman. Now she has her website, and her calculations are corroborated. The next one was a Swedish Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, Svante Arrhenius, who calculated, and with a pencil and a ruler on a white piece of paper, the burning of fossil fuels and the warming of the atmosphere. He was, on the one hand, pleased. He thought that Sweden's harsh climate would become mellower, and so he actually welcomed it. And he also thought that it would take centuries. What he did not know is how far, he calculated this in about 1898, how quickly industrialization would pump carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So in the UN, it was in the year 1988 first recognized by a resolution, Future of Mankind. It was gender insensitive, Future of Mankind, in December 1988, spearheaded by a man, Michael, you might remember him. He was the Maltese, he was a D1 in legal affairs of the treaty section. And then he became the permanent representative of Malta. His name is on the tip of my, it'll come to me. So that was the resolution based on which then the Rio Earth Summit was held, and on which the Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed in Rio in 92, and the Convention on Biological Diversity. But in the 30 years since that Convention on Climate Change was signed, it was ratified a bit later, 94, more carbon dioxide has been emitted into the atmosphere than in all prior human history. And I'll get to what that actually means from a policy point of view. But before, so to come back to the catastrophe of 2023, or actually, it made it visible. We hear now of a group called the Last Generation, people who glue themselves to artwork or to highways or to airports and so on. And the term Last Generation is actually very apt. It was coined by the governor of Washington State, Jay Inslee. He ran for the Democratic presidency, but lost to Biden. He didn't go very far in the primaries. A very visionary man who said that we are the first generation that actually sense and feel and see climate change, but we are the last generation that can actually do something about it. So they just took his name. What is puzzling is that although the science has been clear for a very long time, the models become ever more granular, ever more precise. No forceful political reaction has emerged or is emerging. Quite the opposite. If you look at it, you will hear it on Friday officially from the British Prime Minister. I read in The Guardian today, but you've heard this already in the last couple of weeks, that the UK is happy to scrap what they call the green crap. This is astonishing. More liberal governments, like for example in the US or in Germany, where the Green Party is part of government, there is a lot of investment in technology, doing very interesting things, but not articulating the crisis, the problem as it is, which is dire. And that's why they're also dropping in support, because people sense that something is going on and they are not being told the truth. There's also this worry about letting yellow vests sleep, not angering business, not imposing any hardship, as if the greatest challenge humanity has ever faced could be dealt with without any sacrifice or without any cost. I think it is simply not true, but we will hear about it as the crisis accelerates. What I find worrisome, but very evident, is that the climate discussion has become part of the culture wars. If you are conservative, you have a big car, an SUV, and if you are in favor of gender equality, you have an electric car. I mean, to caricature it a little bit, but it is no longer on the merit. It is now like with the masks during COVID. If you wear a mask, you're left wing, and if you don't wear a mask, you're a real man. It is interesting to see how, when polling is done, and actually there was one done in Germany only yesterday, and it asked if the demand of the Last Generation climate group, they demand that Germany will get out of all fossil fuels by 2030. If that is supported, and the question is this demand right, absolutely right, or essentially right? I have no view. It is essentially wrong, or it is absolutely wrong. Anybody want to take a guess? What is the distribution between right and wrong? But this demand is absolutely wrong. What is the rough percentage? Anyway, 59% say it is absolutely wrong, and 11% say it is essentially wrong. So we are talking 70% of the German population think that this demand that we should be out of fossil fuels by 2030 is wrong. The government has promised by 2035, by the way. So 70% is actually against it. Now, a lot of very interesting work is going on around the world in science, in governments too. So the German environmental agency, Umweltbundesamt, has done a 500-page, both detailed study or a methodology, if you're interested. It is called the Methodological Convention for the Assessment of Environmental Costs. And so they are calculating that the cost of a ton of carbon dioxide currently in Germany is between 195 and 680 euro per ton. And they're calculating this, not the cost at the pump if you fill up your car or if you fly with an airplane, but the cost that is involved in terms of damage, in terms of biodegradation, in terms of lung cancers, mortality, whatever. And the difference between 195 euro and 680 is what is called the discount rate, whether one values the current generation's benefits higher as future. In other words, if the welfare of current and future generations is equally weighted, then the higher price applies. But if we take our benefits value higher and we don't care about the future, it would be lower, it would be 195. Well, in reality, in the European Union, a ton of carbon is 30 euro. So very far away from the 195, or let alone the 680. It is very clear if the carbon price were 200 euro or 500 or 690, the economy would change. Cars would become much smaller, renewable energy would become much more profitable, carbon capture would be even financially sensible, not just ecologically, but financial. Okay, back to a poll. In mid-August, the same national poll in Germany asked if they were prepared to pay a higher carbon dioxide price than the current 30 euro, if it would save the climate. So a higher price for gasoline, for heating oil, and for gas. And not surprisingly, it was the same 70% that said absolutely not. And it was the same 26% or so that would say yes. So that is stunning. This was taken in mid-August when the world was burning, when we had floods everywhere, when the temperatures were boiling. So 2/3 of the people would not envisage current sacrifice for future benefits. Even though it's known and it's clear in science and it's clear by politicians that saving money today is like living in a house with a leaking roof. So you save money by not fixing it. So it's completely false economies because the price of what will have to be paid will be infinitely higher down the road. So the UN just put out a study, UNEP, that 2023 will see the historically highest level of carbon dioxide emissions. 8 years after Paris, where we should be going down, we're actually going up. UNDP this Monday put out a study, I can send you the link, which says that in the last 3 years, carbon dioxide emissions have increased in 72 out of 95 economies. They should be going down, but they're going up. So the world continues to invest in fossil fuels and also subsidizes them. Again, I read a figure from the UNFCCC Secretariat that the investment in renewable energy is about 800 million, but the subsidies for fossil fuels is about 1.2 trillion. So we're still blowing hot and cold. And yesterday, President Biden talked very much about the common humanity and whatever. But his own Environment Information Agency puts out that the US will pump 73 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere through new sources of oil and gas, not running old ones, but through new ones. So this is, and at the same time, the US insurance companies, State Farm, AIG, and others, are pulling out of Florida and California because they're not willing any longer to insure the risks for homeowners, both of flooding or of burning, of fires. At the same time, these insurance companies invest billions of dollars in the fossil fuels that cause the risk that they're no longer insuring. So why is this insanity? Obviously, I don't think there is not one clear categorical answer. But let me suggest a few. On the one hand, this is the greatest global public policy challenge that humanity has ever faced. Because most crises in the past, even the Holocaust, or even Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, were essentially regional affairs. We are moving into an era where things are truly global, and what happens in one part has effects in the other. The other interesting and hugely important aspect that is often ignored when you hear, oh, China is the largest emitter, they should. Well, true, but carbon dioxide is what is called in science, it is an infinite lifetime gas. Even the campfires of the Crusaders going to Jerusalem 900 years ago are still warming the atmosphere today, metaphorically speaking. But every carbon dioxide molecule that was emitted since the Industrial Revolution makes a difference today. So the West, which means essentially Europe, which means essentially North America, which means Australia and Japan, developed by burning fossil fuels for the past nearly 300 years, 280 years. If you picture this as a bathtub, or let me put it differently, in economics, you have what is called a stock issue and a flow issue. And carbon dioxide is both. So in the bathtub, what is in there, 2/3 full, is what has been put in there for the last 250 years. And the current emissions is the water gushing in through the open tap today. And it is true, China is today the largest contributor, but historically, its contributions were about 7%. So developed countries, and this is the language, by the way, of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, they're still using developed and developing countries. Developed countries have contributed 73% to the stock, and developing countries 27%. In Germany, I always hear, yes, we only contribute 2% to global warming. What we do, what we don't do makes no difference whatsoever. it is true that Germany contributes only 2%, but we are 1% of the world's population. So we're actually taking liberty of emitting twice our share. And if we were considering historic emissions of Germany, it would be 4%. And this essentially is for every Western country, which is something that underlines what is in the UN diplomacy and in the conventions on climate change and the Biodiversity Convention is called common but differentiated responsibilities. Common global problem, but differentiated. Some countries have more responsibility than others. And of course, the responsibility is not only to limit emissions now, but also to help offset emissions elsewhere, to pay. In America, you have the discussion on reparations for slavery. And while nobody will talk about reparations in the climate context, it is very clear that Africa, that has contributed nothing to climate change, is one of the areas most affected by it. So it's an equity issue, and even one of practicality, because emissions that do not happen in Africa also benefit Europe. Per American citizen, the annual emissions are about 18 tons, like for a Canadian. For a European, they're about 9. For Chinese, about 8. For a Russian, 11. For a Ghanaian, 0.3. In other words, 60 Ghanaians have the same footprint as one American. Or one American, if you will, like 60 Ghanaians. And that is where the negotiations in the UN run aground, because it's politically not viable for an American politician to say, we have to reduce, we have to invest, we have to pay. Okay, so I'm just giving you a catalog of reasons why this is such a wicked, intractable problem. We in the West have become used to cheap energy. I ask my students, and I ask you now, if you know, you're all in Geneva, I presume, what is the price of a kilowatt hour of electricity in Geneva, or a price of a kilowatt hour of natural gas? Anybody know? What are you paying? Exactly. You don't know because it is so damn cheap. If it were a serious cost factor, you would know. And because we don't, I mean, in Vienna, it is something like 21 cents for a new customer. Industry pays 12. For gas, it's cheaper. It's only about 7 cents. And that's about the same in all European countries. So completely insignificant. But do you have any idea what a kilowatt hour does, what it means in terms of physical power? Well, a kilowatt hour of electricity, a kilowatt hour of electricity will transport 40 kilos from sea level to the top of Mount Everest. So 40 kilo, that is a small child. You can put a child on your back and you walk up Mount Everest. When you're up there, you have spent 1 kilowatt hour worth 21 cents. So it's absolutely ridiculous. And that is, in my view, one of the reasons why we are so profligate with energy and why the environmental crisis is so extreme. Whether the power is run by the sun or wind or coal or oil or gas, if it costs only 21, if it is worth 21 cents to carry 40 kilos on top of to the top of Mount Everest, you're wasting it. And you're wasting it whether you run it on batteries, whether you dig it in the Congo or in Colombia. We are profligate with our use of energy. And if you think that a continent like Africa, 600 million people have no access to electricity yet, so they can't even run a ceiling fan, they can't charge their phones, they can't have a fridge. So you see this equity, the imbalance in the world. So fossil fuel industries, big oil, car manufacturers in Germany, everywhere, are pushing that we can continue like this. Yeah, we have a few solar cells and so on, but essentially we continue business as usual, and we continue with this relentless growth, which frankly is insane. I looked at it the other day because there was an exhibit of old cars in Vienna. And I was struck because I had in the 70s a Fiat 850. And there was one was driving around, and it was such a small little car. So I couldn't find the data for the Fiat, but I found it for the Golf, Volkswagen Golf. In 1974, the Volkswagen Golf weighed 750 kilos and was 1.60 meters wide. And today's weighs more than double, is 1,600 kilos, and it's 2 meters wide. It's the same car. Of course, its engine is much more efficient, but it's much stronger, and we're driving much more. So the footprint is much higher. Okay, slowly to come to an end. There is a complete disconnect between the physics of climate, or similar in biodiversity, the insights of science, whether it is climatology, whether it is any of the disciplines you want to have. There is not a single Academy of Sciences in the world, whether it's Chinese, Russian, Indian, Australian, Cuban, Danish, that is not in consensus on the findings. And we see this with this wonderful UN creation of the IPCC, which, as you know, the IPCC does not perform original research. It canvasses peer-reviewed analyses from around the world and compiles them and assesses what does it mean. So the scientific consensus is overwhelming. I mean, it is in the high 90s. But the puzzle is that it will not gain traction politically. So we are in a catch-22 situation that the ecologically required is politically not feasible, and the politically feasible is ecologically insufficient. To conclude, I think countries, because it is a choice of countries, it is not a choice of you or me as individuals. You can be vegan, you can sell your car and go biking, makes no difference. It's a choice of governments, and the choice that governments have is a choice between three things. One is investing in mitigation. Mitigation meaning reducing the damage, meaning reducing the emissions of carbon dioxide or even pulling carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Mitigation is reducing the damage. The next one is adaptation, which means learning to live with the damage. You say it's too late, can't do a bloody thing. So we just have to build a higher seawall, or we have to move up the mountain, or what have you. So mitigation was called by this wonderful British economist, Sir Nicholas Stern, who wrote the first report on the environment commissioned by government, by the Blair-Gordon government in 2007, he said mitigation is avoiding the unmanageable. And adaptation, he called managing the unavoidable. So we have the choice between investing in mitigation or in adaptation, or the third choice is suffering. Don't do anything. And then you see what you have seen last week in Libya, what you've seen last year in Pakistan, what will be seen. That will be the new normal. Absolutely no doubt about it. So these are the three choices. And the open question, wide open question, is the mix of the three, because it will be all of the above. What is not yet clear is how where the mix will come out. So let me stop here. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Baumann. If we were concerned until now we are terrified. But you really clarified a lot of issues in very simple words and very straightforward messages. Thank you very much for that. In addition to your paper, that is absolutely excellent. We have a comment from Rick, California, on the US in general, the behavior of the USA. And then a comment or a question from David Dror, Geneva-based, on the role of the UN in this scenario. Maybe you would like to take both of them, or one after the other, and then I have also a specific question if there are no other comments. But please, up to you.
Okay, I don't see okay, I'm going to the chat. Let me see what the question is.
Yes.
Climate change, Mary, can the UN and specialized agencies offer? Well, look, I think the UN, not member states, but the UN Secretariat, particularly UNEP in Nairobi, WMO in Geneva, many others, UNU, have done extraordinary good work and are doing it. UNDP too. I mean, even, a few years ago in 2007, Achim Steiner was the head of UNEP, and there was this UNDP annual, it's called the Human Development Report. So in 2007, let me get it. Yeah, 2007. Look at this. This is the report, and can you read the title?
Yes.
So it was the
Fighting
first.
climate change, yes.
Yeah, human solidarity in a divided world, fighting climate change. And so
Yep.
UNEP and UNDP put this thing out together, 400 pages. This was 2007-8, so this is 15 years ago. So the UN institutionally, even today, UNEP every year, they will do it in November before COP28, which is called the Emissions Gap Report, which is like a thermometer. In the Paris Agreement, the commitments to reduce carbon dioxide emissions are voluntary. They're called nationally determined contributions. Countries determine nationally what they want to do, but the Paris Agreement is 2 degrees maximum, 1.5 desirable, and UNEP issues a gap report, which is the gap between what you have all pledged and how far are we away from 1.5 or 2 degrees. So the analytics of the UNEP gap report is extraordinary. Then there is another one that UNEP puts out, which is called the Production Gap Report, which is countries are saying we will reduce our carbon footprint by 25. I mean, like somebody, a drunkard, to say he'll quit drinking alcohol by 2050. But what UNEP does, they measure investments in fossil fuels, what the banks, what the governments are doing, and the production gap report comes out with very different figures, because this is what countries are investing in, not what they're saying, but what they're doing. And so the UN, and then also there is something that comes out, it probably came out yesterday or so, it's called United in Science, just before the UN General Debate, which is the UN funds and programs on climate, always 20 pages, nice graphs and so on, including the Climate Change Secretariat. So the UN Secretariat is doing extraordinarily competent and good work, but member states are not taking it for domestic reasons. So I have, of course, I wish, of course, that the Secretary General would not only urge countries and dramatize it and say we are code red and all this kind of stuff, but that he would actually build coalitions and so on. But, you know, that's sort of a regret. But the institution, generally, the work that they do that comes out of the UN is something to be proud about. And I don't think the UN Secretariat will have influence over member states to sway, no matter how brilliant the analysis and the document is that comes out of the UN system.
Indeed. Rick has a question on the chat. When it comes to climate change, how can we motivate individuals to avoid passivity, complacency, and disconnection from political action?
It's an interesting thing. And in the 1970s, British Petroleum and later Shell started pushing individual responsibility. And even recently, I saw a thing from Shell. And what are you doing to reduce carbon emissions? That is the most nefarious, devious approach. You cannot individually solve a global political problem. So I lived in the US for 30 years. I did not have a gun, but my not having a gun does not resolve the gun epidemic in the United States. In the 19th century, not owning a slave would not end slavery. So there are problems that can only be dealt with politically. Anti-Semitism cannot be solved by individual virtue. So people are asked as citizens, in the first instance, not as consumers, as citizens, to get engaged, to get involved, to ask every politician that wants your vote, so what are you doing that we are climate neutral by 2030? And what will you do if we're not? I mean, we are, at least in the West, we're not in Russia. I have to digress. A few years ago, before in 2019, my sister is a teacher of Russian, and she organized young kids. She taught in Russia for a few years, and she brought young kids, 15, 16-year-olds to Germany, paid by the Chamber of Commerce, and they were a 2-week program of language and sightseeing and so on. And I gave them a climate talk similar to this one. And a young girl, 17-year-old, in perfect German, asked me, she's from St. Petersburg. I said, this was just a few months after Greta Thunberg had spoken at the COP24 in Katowice. She said, if I sit in front of my school in St. Petersburg, I get arrested. And she said this with her teachers there and frowning on her. And I said, well, yes, one day this will be different in Russia. What you can do is to learn a lot and to understand. And then when the situation is right, you can become active. But we in the West have this luxury and responsibility to be engaged, to change the way the climate is seen, and it is entirely a political problem. There are very many vested interests. that want to buy a bit more time. But whatever is not done today will cost us very dearly next year. So it's a bit like the German kids asking their grandfather, so what did you do? And so we'll be asked, so what have you done? And so we better have a good answer for that.
Yes, I have a question, a very specific one, before Alejandro also has one. But here in Geneva, since many decades now, in the area of trade, international trade, there are binding agreements with very specific legal consequences for member states that violate the WTO agreements. And we have also the Bretton Woods institutions that do not have binding agreements, but have even more than that. They have the financial power to enforce their own decisions and policies. So in the three Bretton Woods institutions, we have very powerful multilateral instruments that are applied since decades now. So in the area of climate, we do not have any binding instrument, as you note in your paper. Can we have some hope that maybe one day we will get there to have a binding Paris Agreement?
No, not necessarily. And you don't actually even need it. If you have the United States, the EU, and a few other countries, China, and for example, you do this border adjustment thing. This can be harmonized with WTO rules that you raise on entry, so prevent dumping, climate dumping, that if the European Union, for example, were to raise its carbon price from 30 euro to 300, and then levy something on imports, of course, you can say to China, you can also charge 300, and then we import your goods as is. But if you don't, we levy it at the point of entry. The US will do something like this. I'm sure there are ways that can be done. I don't know the details. So I think the issue is not so much of a legally binding universal agreement as a few powerful countries establishing rules, like California. If California demands a certain fleet average of cars, every car producer or seller in the United States complies with it because they don't want to have a car for California and one for Minnesota. So California sets the standard, and I think the EU and the US can, if they would. Yeah, so it has to be a best practice. And frankly, it doesn't matter what Switzerland does, but it matters what the EU does. And it matters what the United States do, and certainly China, and then everybody else will fall into place.
Well, as you know, the import issue, the EU imposing tariffs on imports from the global south that are environmental friendly, it's a big issue because it is penalizing anyway some developing countries' economies. But that's another discussion, but it's a parallel one, in fact. Yeah. There is another question from David. What is the share of resources devoted to reduction of carbon emissions is allocated to grassroots reductions, for example, for energy transition of open pit stoves in homes using highly polluting biomass, which is a huge issue in India and many African countries. Do you have some views on that?
I could find it. I don't know it offhand. I could easily find it. I think there are very important, there are very solid data. Also, IRENA puts out lots of things on investment. And by the way, the International Energy Agency in Paris puts out magnificent documents on renewables, on their energy, their data. They put out monthly electricity, gas, oil reports, and so on. And just in another article, I quoted a study that came out a few days ago. That's what I was quoting before when I said about the 75 billion tons of carbon that will come out of US investments. It's report on called Oil Change. So there is the data is there. I don't know offhand exactly what they are, but I give you a stunning piece of data, which is at Rio in 1992, the world's energy was about 80% fossil fuels. In 2023, the world's energy is about 80% fossil fuels. We haven't moved in 30 years. What we have done is we have moved up. The share is still the same. Some internal adjustments, so solar and wind are much more prominent now, and nuclear is much less. But our energy consumption is about 3 times what it was in the 1990s. So this relentless growth is what is adding to the global heating. But if you wanted, David, if you want specific data on renewable investment, send me your email, and I'll pull out some data or sources for you.
Thank you very much. Geshe is asking about the communication issue. If the key is in politics, the key tool will be communication and credible social policies. Can you help with tools for either or both?
I think it is evidently climate and social justice are flip side of the same coins. And I think it is quite nefarious to pitch one against the other. Absolutely not. If you look at data, for example, something like 80% of the world's population, so we are 8 billion, so 6.5 billion have never set foot in an airplane, have never flown. So the distribution of emissions by the top 10% income earners in Europe and in the United States, the top 10 emit about as much as the bottom 60. It is quite interestingly parallel to income and wealth distribution. So the carbon footprint of wealthy people, not only those with private jets, also people who are probably including us, our carbon footprint, for instance, for many of the top 10%, their greatest carbon footprint comes actually from their investments. It is not from their, if they eat meat or not, it is where they put their money. And if they watch whether, my wife is Canadian, so we have a base in Canada, and we were shocked to find out that the Royal Bank of Canada is one of the most polluting investors in the world. And so we thought we put our money in a savings account and we find nice Canadians. Not at all. So investments is a big component of people who have investments to see that their investments do not counteract their politics. And I was very pleased the university I was involved with for the last many years, New York University, has, after a struggle of 10 years, announced last week that it would divest all its holdings from fossil fuels industry. By the way, if I may, the UN Secretary General is in charge of our pension. He runs the pension fund. The UN Secretary General has not announced that the UN pension fund will divest from fossil fuel industries. He could do this with a stroke of a pen without, the pension fund is entirely in the purview of the Secretary General. There is no link to any member state. And I've been wrestling with this, and I've been engaged in whatever. And there was then a year ago, 2 years ago, that the pension fund is divesting from secondary coal industry. It's a technical term that nobody knows. Secondary coal industry means from power plants that burn coal. So we are still, our pension money is still in digging up coal, but no longer in burning coal. And because the dividends in fossil fuels are high, that's why we're not embarrassed. And I would have hoped that the Secretary General will say, when he always says raise ambition, that he makes a point saying the United Nations pension fund has divested from all fossil fuel assets, like New York University or Harvard or the Church of England. Hasn't come yet. As he could also push, if he wanted to get fossil fuels out of UN peacekeeping. Hasn't done it for many other reasons. But I'm digressing, sorry.
Thank you very much, Dr. Baumann. I will give the floor to Alejandro immediately. And thank you again for your fantastic presentation.
Yes, actually, I have a follow-up question because I'm an actuary myself. I'm an ex-ILO, and I represented the ILO at the UN Pension Fund. And can you close your micro, Manuela? Yes. Because now
Yes.
the recording is on you, not on the rest.
Oh.
Sorry. So, and I can confirm that the ILO, we were frustrated that not only the investment of our pension fund in fossil instruments was maintained, but everything that had to do even with suspicion of child labor or unacceptable working conditions, that was rejected systematically in our pension fund. We were frustrated to be representing social justice at the UN and not being able in our own pension system to do that. And I have an issue about and I really like the ponderation that you make of the cost of 100 euros when you focus on the current generation, and 600 and something when you consider the future generations. But to me, there is a fundamental problem, a fundamental issue. The issue is that the system still rewards immediate satisfaction. The system still rewards immediate profit to the rest. So it's really completely insane, as you just mentioned. Try to change things if the system is not changed. Also, I'm extremely frustrated that the governments have to play such an important role in the future of global warming when, in my experience as UN official, is the life expectancy of any minister and life expectancy of any government is very limited. Ministers change every 6 months or 2 years in every country, and presidents can go to the right, to the left every 4, 5, or 6 years, and you can adopt whatever you want in Paris or anywhere, and the next will just cut it down or ignore it. So we're putting the future in hands of something that is completely unstable. And on the other hand, also coming to I was really very happy when, as an actuary, I noticed that the insurance company and the pension funds pledged to the Secretary General of the UN, actually it was in Brazil, also in Rio, pledged that the investments of the pension funds and in insurance companies would be invested in ecologically and humanitarian social issues. But to me, that was just lip service. And I think that many, as you mentioned, Shell, lip service has become the rule, doing the same old things and just put an presentable new label that might attract. and I have an issue, but it would be possibly the subject for another great talk. I have the issue of the role of democracies and the role of social media and communications, as Geshe mentioned. I was just stunned, and I spent last week in Washington, D.C., and it was burning. We have 37, 38 degrees centigrades. It was burning, but there was nothing that would call the attention to the warm things, because everybody was with air conditioning. Bus and metro were with air conditioning, and all the attention was in sports and consuming and buying cars and all the rest. And that's, of course, not an exception. When I watch Mexican television, I get the same. Social media are not really requesting. Possibly now, this week, because there is a General Assembly in New York, they are mentioning it, but they will forget it when we'll have the Super Bowl or the World Cup. So democracy, communication, and the lack of continuity of governments, it's a huge concern. I don't know if you would have to comment on this, or we'll leave it for another great topic.
No, if we have 2 hours, I could comment on every of your point. And of course, I'm agreeing with you. But, you know, as an academic, I'm looking and I'm talking to young people. And one of the approaches is to think you are a visitor from outer space. And you look what humanity does, how humanity is dealing with this issue. It gives you an interesting perspective. First of all, and then, you know, humanity is not a homogeneous block, but you have various countries and so on. But what is also very interesting, I think, is that, and you mentioned it, Alejandro, and I have no answer for this, political systems, whether democracies or autocracies, have a limited time horizon. They need to get benefits. They want to be either re-elected or not to have a military coup or not to die in your bed, whatever. So you have to present goods to the current generation. And so for the future is après moi le déluge. And it is terribly unfair. And I've asked my students to come up with a metaphor, you know, like we're flying across the Atlantic in an airplane and then we're running out of gas and we have to throw 10 people off the plane or whatever. What the situation is, and I have not come up with a better one, and I'm slightly hesitating. Maybe you can come up with a better one, and please email me then. We are in a situation of a pregnant woman who insists on her right to continue smoking and drinking. So her right to live the life that she wants to live, and nobody can tell her what to do, except that the consequences are not only borne by her. Normally, in a risk situation, you have a risk taker and you have a risk beneficiary who likes the thrill, and somebody who bears the consequences. And if a guy with a motorbike doesn't wear a helmet, the risk taker and the thrill and the consequence is the same person. But the smoking, the roles, the risk taker and the payer are different people. And with the climate situation, it is clear that us, our group, demographically, we will be okay. But the people, the next generation or the generation thereafter will not. And so we are externalizing the risk to other generation, but that other generation doesn't have a vote. You see, Alejandro, democracies work with current voters. Future voters, future generations, or the people in the global south or other species have no vote. And to tell a politician to take that into consideration is very tricky. I mean, look, I'm not depressed because I see, and you might have seen the pictures of the 70,000 demonstrators on Sunday in New York. there's something happening, and you see California now suing big oil, and you see in lots of jurisdictions things going in the right direction. So I'm cautiously optimistic. You know, I am absolutely certain that the fossil era is over. It is over, but it is like a dinosaur still thrashing around. And the question is whether it will be over fast enough and without causing damage that cannot be recovered. So if we had another 25 years, I wouldn't even worry. But we don't have 25 years. We have probably 5 or 6 years. If we don't stabilize the climate, then tipping points are crossed and automatisms come into play, where it no longer matters what humans do or don't do. Currently, it still matters what we do or what we do not do. But within a decade, we become completely irrelevant. Once the permafrost in Asia melts, or once Antarctica cracks or Greenland ice, and once the climate takes over, human action or inaction are completely irrelevant. So it is actually the next couple of years. And, you know, normally in human psychology, it is, we think in German, we say, kommt Zeit, kommt Rat. So if not today, then tomorrow, or sleep over it, or whatever. Things will become easier tomorrow, or with passing of time. A very hallowed UN principle, too, that you put peacekeepers into Lebanon 50 years ago, and they're called an interim force, but they're playing for time. So they're holding things so it's not getting worse. But climate is not negotiating. And if we don't do something in the next half decade, maybe 8 years, it doesn't matter anymore what we do. So that is the drama, and that is the tragedy, and that's the urgency that I do understand those young kids that glue themselves to the highway. I fear that they are scoring own goals because people are so mad at them, so they actually might do more damage to the cause. They're absolutely right, but doing the wrong thing, I think. We'll see in a couple, maybe they shake everybody up and maybe they turn out to be right. I don't know. But anyway, look, I thank you so much for your questions. I find it always stimulating. It helps me with my work. And if you have any questions, Geshe or Manuela or Alejandro, collect them, send me an email, and I'll try to get you answers or get you sources that might contain some of the answers that your people are interested in.
Well, thank you really very much, Dr. Baumann. This was really a very informative and exciting presentation. You used the words paradox, insanity, challenge, ridiculous, insane, but at the end, you are optimist. So I think we should be continue working on this and acting on this. So by all means, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it. And we hope that this is just our first contact, and we will continue doing things together with Grace. Thank you very much, Dr.
Pleasure. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you,
Wiedersehen.
everybody.
Cheers.
Tschüss.
Bye.